My guest today is Pranay Vaddi, a nuclear weapons and arms control expert who's worked at the highest levels of the U.S. government. He served in multiple roles at the U.S. State Department, at the National Security Council, and was a special assistant to President Biden. Vaddi joins me in the wake of U.S. attacks on the Iranian nuclear program and important questions about what happens next. Vaddi helps us understand how nuclear weapons are made, how close Iran really was to a bomb, why the U.S. struck when it did, and his opinion that the threat of an Iranian nuclear weapon is still very real. All right, Pranay Vaddi, thanks so much for taking some time to come on the World and Stuff podcast. I really appreciate it. I wanted to start off by getting into your background a little bit. You did undergrad degrees in biochemistry and political science, law school at Pitt. How do you end up becoming a nuclear weapons expert?
Yeah, well, one, I think I avoid calling myself an expert at anything because I've had this weird and varied educational and then a professional pathway. I try to do a lot of mentorship and involvement in these young professional programs. So I actually do get this question a lot. Sort of like a lot of people are plotting their careers, 20 years down the road. And I went from thinking I was going to be a doctor and pre-med in undergrad. um, I decided I needed to salvage something of that when I decided to change course and go towards law school. So I finished a biochemistry degree, political science degree, because I was always kind of a government and politics nut. Went to law school. I thought, oh, I'm kind of a technical person. Maybe I'll do patent law or intellectual property law. I didn't find that particularly energetic, to say the least. At least the work that I was trying to get experience doing in my summer associateships and whatnot. The legal market was pretty bad in 2009 and 10, so I applied for the Presidential Management Fellows program, a program that was recently cut by the new administration. I was able to secure a job in the federal government in 2010, and then ever since then, I've basically just kind of been wrapped into the international security space, some congressional affairs work as well. But when I was at the State Department doing congressional affairs work and covering national security issues, I had the privilege of getting to work with some of the foremost nuclear arms control experts, people like Rose Gottemuller and Tom Countryman, and I became really interested in this field. So I decided to try to take my career in more of a subject matter expert direction. I had the opportunity to work at the Carnegie Endowment after leaving the civil service after 8 or 9 years, and then I became a political appointee in the Biden administration, going back into government, and that culminated in my last position, which was the senior director for arms control, nonproliferation, and disarmament at the National Security Council for Joe Biden. Now I'm back on the outside at MIT, and I'm trying to help people understand this sort of crazy world that we're in when it comes to nuclear weapons issues.
Yeah, and you've been writing a lot of interesting articles lately. A lot of it, some of it centered around what has recently happened in Iran, and I want to spend a lot of time talking about that. But first, I want to help people get to that by understanding a little bit about what nuclear weapons are. If you could help us understand it maybe on a lay level so that we don't get too far over people's heads, me included, because I'm obviously not a nuclear weapons expert. But so we want to talk about how you get to a nuclear weapon. It starts with something that's natural, right? Uranium is found in the ground. It's mined out of the ground. Some of the biggest countries that produce it, it's pretty common around the world, but I guess Kazakhstan is one of the biggest producers of uranium ore. Shout out Borat. And then it's milled into yellow cake, which is what Mos Def was holding in the famous Chappelle show skit. So with that foundation, take it away.
So great! I think you laid a great foundation there, and it's not that easy to find pop culture references for this type of work, particularly pre Oppenheimer. But I think you found two of the good ones. Maybe I'll talk a little bit about the fuel cycle. So I think you sort of laid out some of the key sort of precursor steps you need. Right, you get this stuff out of the ground, you get it to look like the Mos Def's yellow cake. And then you're kind of in the early phase of the fuel cycle. And this is also a good way to think about Iran's nuclear program. Peaceful nuclear programs, you want to take that yellow cake and you need to process it. There's a chemical process to get it into a place where you can enrich it as necessary to get the fission reaction that you would have in a reactor. So the first thing you need to do with that mined uranium is a chemical process called conversion. So a lot of the news that you've heard about lately, the Trump administration's advocacy for the strikes and sort of what pieces of the program they were able to take out, they've talked a lot about a conversion facility. The point of the conversion facility is really to take that solid uranium, that yellow cake, process it in a way that and mix it with fluoride gas to become what's called UF6. And you might see this in IAEA reports and stuff. I mean, maybe you don't, but these are the types of things that I try to look for when I'm trying to figure out what's going on in Iran. So they create this uranium hexafluoride gas, which they then spin in centrifuges. And the purpose of spinning the centrifuge is you get kind of the heavier particles to the bottom of the centrifuge. And that's the way in which you create higher concentrations of uranium, which when you mine it out of the earth, it's not in a very high concentration. It's sort of few parts of uranium per million parts of other things. As you enrich it, though, it becomes a little bit more potent as a potential fuel source. You enrich it a lot, and you can form it in a way with such a concentration and energy density. That's when you can get the type of fission reaction that you call, criticality, which could result in a nuclear explosion. So you need to go from mining to conversion to turn it from powder to gas to enrichment as a gas, and then you can use that material basically converted back into another form. And as we get into the conversation about the airstrikes, we can talk about why are they talking about uranium metal now? Do you need uranium metal to make a bomb? What kind of bomb is it, etc.? But maybe I'll stop there. That's kind of, I think you sort of kicked us off in the fuel cycle discussion, and then maybe we can talk a little bit more about that as we talk about Iran.
Yeah, and there's also a difference too between, so eventually you get to highly enriched uranium above 90%, but that doesn't necessarily give you something you can shoot at somebody or drop on somebody, explode, right? You have to weaponize that. Can you just help people understand the bridge that has to be crossed here? There's a difference between being able to test a bomb and deliver a bomb.
That's completely right, and it's a good way to think about it, because one of the key questions that's out there right now is, did Iran have a weapon? Did they get close to a weapon? What was it that they hadn't done yet? And so this weaponization discussion is actually really important. One of the things you need to be able to do after you get that highly enriched uranium, so let's say 90% enriched uranium, is form it in a way that if you were to set off the nuclear reaction, you would try to maximize the amount of energy that comes out of that explosion. So that's when people are talking about the mechanics of creating larger yield in a device. So there are sort of mechanical attributes to a nuclear weapon that are required to create that kind of reflection and the bigger energy release that's required. You also might need to have the uranium sit in a different form. I was mentioning before, you get that higher enriched uranium. Your goal is to get maximum energy density for the amount of mass that you have. So if you can put that into a metal form, ideally kind of spherical if you're thinking about how Oppenheimer and the images you saw in that movie, that's how you can maximize the energy density, again, to get that yield. But I think what you're getting at is, how do you actually deliver a weapon? And can you get the weapon in a deliverable form? It's one thing to kind of pack a bunch of uranium into a tin can and blow it up in the desert to show the world that you know how to do it. It's relatively simple. But if you want to be able to deliver a nuclear weapon at range, you need to know that whatever your warhead is that you design, you can put it on a missile or in a bomb and be able to get it from point A to point B. So let's say that one of Iran's future goals is to have a nuclear weapon that they could deliver via one of their many ballistic missiles that they've been showing off, and they, for example, recently fired at Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar. They would need to ensure that that weapon not only won't kind of shake apart given the stresses that are involved with ballistic missile flight, but that it could survive reentry, because these ballistic missiles actually put a warhead outside of the atmosphere, and it has to survive and have heat shielding to make it all the way through the Earth's atmosphere, and then have the technical wherewithal to still go off at when it hits the ground or in the air at some prescribed distance from the target. And so all of that has to work in concert. And by the way, it has to be accurate as well. So there's a lot of steps left to go through after you get the potential material you need to set off a nuclear explosion. And I think one of the big questions that's out there right now is, Was Iran actually very far along that pathway to actually weaponize the device, or are we just talking about Iran getting to the point where it had enough material to then move towards weaponization?
Because it would seem to me it's a lot more complex to put it on a missile and shoot it up into space and have it come down in the right location as opposed to flying it on a plane over like Japan, which the US did at the end of World War II, and just drop it out of a plane.
That's right. And the key difference there is the stresses involved with shooting it on a missile at the type of speed, hypersonic speed that a ballistic missile may go out of the atmosphere and then bringing it back down requires all sorts of different heat shielding and accuracy, seekers and that sort of thing that would go into the reentry vehicle, which is, again, not exactly part of the warhead, but the warhead and the reentry vehicle have to basically be harmonious with one another because the warhead has to survive reentry. If you just put it in a big bomb, think of the Enola Gay, it was used to bomb Hiroshima. The bomb will face some stresses as well. You'll use a parachute to retard its speed, so you can kind of control its descent and its accuracy. But ultimately, it's very different. You don't have to worry about the heat and the sort of thermal effects and the stresses that come with re-entering the Earth's atmosphere in the same way.
And it would be a lot harder for Iran to fly a plane over Israel or the United States or any of our allies than it was for the US to fly a plane over Japan in, the late 1940s.
Yeah, it's a great point. I mean, the sort of operational realities of delivering a nuclear weapon today are very different than they were in 1945, particularly if you're thinking about Iran and its comparative military capabilities today versus Israel, who's shown an ability to knock down every drone, missile, and aircraft pretty much that comes near it. And so I would suspect that if Iran were actually moving towards weaponizing its nuclear program and wanted to put a weapon on a delivery system, they would choose one of their ballistic missiles because, one thing that we've heard a lot about over the past 2 decades is how Iran has the largest ballistic missile force of any Middle Eastern country.
Okay, so let's talk about Iran's nuclear program. It actually started in the 1950s with the help of the United States. President Eisenhower had this program, Atoms for Peace, which might not seem like it makes a whole lot of sense now, but back then it did, specifically when it came to Iran. This was before the Iranian Revolution. Iran was headed by the Shah, and it was an ally of the United States. What was the thinking behind Atoms for Peace and why the U.S. wanted to help Iran develop a nuclear program?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, in part we have to remember, and none of us were alive at that point, but atomic energy presented so much promise in addition to being one of the world's scariest new technologies at the time. It was all relatively new, less than 10 years old at that point. And the idea that the world could seize upon this technology and use it for peaceful purposes was too good to pass up. One, it allowed the United States to go from this sort of actor that used this weapon in anger to try to end World War II with capping the amount of loss of life that had already occurred, to become a little bit more benevolent and find ways to share this technology for the good of all mankind. And obviously, we were in the midst of not just trying to share nuclear power and harness its potential for medical and energy and other purposes, but also rebuild the world order and build a UN system that was equitable for everyone. And so, in the context of wanting to find some good uses of what was initially advertised as a weapons capability, Atoms for Peace offered an opportunity for the United States to take all of the time and effort and money that was put into the atomic program and utilize it for the benefits of all of the world. And obviously, as if you think about, so obviously there was a superpower competition that emerged, and so nuclear weapons, both in the United States and the Soviet Union and our respective blocs, started to stack up in numbers, and the U.S. atomic monopoly ended pretty quickly after the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings. However, one of the aspects of Atoms for Peace that survived is this idea that the United States and other countries that had been able to develop atomic energy indigenously, and some of whom had atomic weapons programs, wanted to ensure when they entered the 1960s that other countries didn't proliferate. I think after 3 Berlin crises and the Cuban Missile Crisis, the desire for some sort of controls, international controls on the proliferation of this technology became really serious. And there were efforts to do this in the 40s with the Baruch Plan, to try to have essentially international control of atomic energy. That failed as a result, in part, of the superpower competition that emerged. But when you move into the negotiation of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the three key pillars of that treaty are disarmament, that the countries that have nuclear weapons and were signing up to the treaty agreed they would try to get rid of their weapons over time. Non-proliferation, that all the countries would cooperate on preventing the spread of illicit nuclear technology to countries, so that other nuclear weapons programs wouldn't begin. And then the third part was peaceful uses. So, coming from Atoms for Peace, the idea that there needs to be a bargain between disarmament and non-proliferation and the potential international cooperation and assistance that can come with nuclear energy. So, the nuclear weapon states agreed to find in a controlled way a pathway to sharing nuclear technology with countries that wanted to utilize it for energy production, electricity production, medical isotope production for health reasons, and radiological reasons for medical radiology. So those three pillars were enshrined in a treaty that almost every country has signed up for and currently abides by. And so now in the Iran context, one of the big concerns out there, Iran is a non-nuclear weapon state. It's a party to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And the potential that might threaten to withdraw shows that maybe this bargain isn't enough for some countries, and we worry that other countries might follow suit.
So the Islamic Revolution happens in 1979. The Iran basically becomes a U.S. enemy. It becomes a theocracy. Ayatollah Khomeini takes over. Originally, he says that having nuclear weapons is un-Islamic and they don't go for that program. But then war breaks out with Iraq, and in the midst of that war, Iran starts to develop a program and then gets a boost from Pakistan. Tell us about how Iran shifted from not wanting nuclear weapons to advancing a program and getting help from Pakistan.
Yeah, so I think you're making a really good connection here, which is that for a lot of countries, not just Iran, but when countries think about nuclear proliferation, in large part it's because they find themselves in really challenging security circumstances. So in the case of Iran, after fighting what was a really bloody war in the 80s that took years and years and years, where seemingly Iraq had a asymmetric advantage in being able to use chemical munitions against Iran. And of course, Iran post-revolution was had declared itself obviously an enemy of the state of Israel in addition to the United States, and Israel's pretty close by. I think the Iranian government felt they needed some sort of deterrent capability because they lived in just a tough neighborhood. And so the Iranians began their nuclear weapons project in, I think, roughly 1989, as you mentioned, right after the Iran-Iraq War. And over time, they got assistance from a person named A.Q. Khan in Pakistan, who was known to help run these sort of proliferation networks that involved Iran and North Korea, based on the research he was doing in Pakistan as part of their own nuclear energy and eventually weapons program that they revealed in the 90s. So this was a proliferation network that was well known to the United States and other countries. I think the U.S. government and other countries tried to play whack-a-mole to try to take this network down. But the Iranian program was pretty far along at that point. Eventually, if you fast forward into the late 90s and into the early 2000s, I think enough information was provided through intelligence channels to the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, that's currently run by Director General Rafael Grossi, that they started to ask questions of Iran, essentially, what are your intentions? And as you mentioned, Iran had a nuclear program, not necessarily a weapons program, but they had a nuclear program at the time, in part because they had gotten nuclear technology from the United States before the Shah fell. The Tehran Research Reactor, for example, is a good example of that. I think they've had assistance from China, and obviously we mentioned they had this more discreet assistance from A.Q. Khan in Pakistan. But the IAEA slowly gathered information from member states, including Israel and presumably the United States, that Iran had launched this weapons effort. And so over the course of asking questions about this, it seems like, and we don't have a full picture of this, I mean, this is part of the big debate over JCPOA, is these sort of prior military dimensions of Iran's nuclear program that Iran has refused to answer questions about. So according to the IAEA, they had started to think about how could they design nuclear weapons payloads, and then think about other steps they need to take in the weaponization realm. So, what are the types of explosive components you need? Because, when we were talking about this kind of really high energy density uranium core, you need to compress that with an explosion. That's actually pretty technically complex to do. But the IAEA was asking questions because they thought Iran might be doing some of this work. This was all part of what is referred to as the Ahmad project or the Ahmad plan. But all evidence suggests that the Iranians ceased this program in 2003, I think in part because the IAEA caught them. And then if you move into the Obama administration, that's where you had a much more concerted effort to put some restrictions and increase the transparency into Iran's nuclear program because there were concerns that they could potentially return to this plan.
Yeah, let's talk about that. We get to the Obama administration. It strikes me that he comes into power on the heels of the Iraq War and the war in Afghanistan. They're still kind of going on when he comes into power, but very much ran on displeasure in the country over those military adventures. And it seemed like there was a push within the Obama administration to let's figure out how we can limit this rogue actor and its nuclear program without having to go to war again. So that's essentially, I guess, where the JCPOA came from. Can you just help us understand what exactly it did?
Sure. So, broad strokes, the point of JCPOA was to take what Iran was suggesting was a totally civilian nuclear program and essentially build the guardrails around it to ensure that it was a civilian nuclear program. And so, some of the facilities that have been mentioned in the news lately, Fordo, Natanz, Iraq, essentially the enrichment capacity of those sites was augmented and focused so that they could be unequivocally used just for civilian use. They wanted to make sure that reactors that could be used for things in addition to uranium, like plutonium production, were repurposed so that they were only used for medical research, industrial research, sort of isotope production, things that we knew could be essentially could be separated away from a weapons program. Most importantly, with JCPOA, it didn't just allow the IAEA to inspect under their existing agreements they had bilaterally with Iran. It gave the IAEA much more enhanced verification and monitoring rights in Iran. So Iran essentially signed up to not just its safeguards agreement with the IAEA, which is kind of the baseline agreement that any country with nuclear technology is supposed to sign with the IAEA. There's an additional protocol which is designed for the IAEA to essentially say, hey, we're worried that you have undeclared nuclear activities. We want to go to this spot. It's not a site that you've declared. It's actually an undeclared site, but we want to go check there. Can you give us information about that site and can we get there? What the Iranians did in JCPOA is actually go far beyond even that additional protocol. And I know I'm using a term of art, but essentially JCPOA is designed to maximize transparency into Iran's nuclear program, which hitherto the world did not have. And up until 2018, the U.S. government repeatedly and annually stated that Iran was in compliance with JCPOA. JCPOA did minimize the level of enrichment that Iran was allowed to attain with its uranium enrichment. They were enriching at 3.67% purity uranium, which is essentially standard for the types of nuclear reactors we have in the United States. These large nuclear power plants, like the ones at the Vogel site in Georgia that were just completed recently. And now where we are is Iran is enriched to both 20% and then eventually 60% as part of the sort of post JCPOA world. So, needless to say, there's a lot of criticism for JCPOA. Israel, Saudi Arabia, a bunch of Arab countries, and frankly, Iranian hardliners really didn't like JCPOA because to them it allowed Iran to continue enriching uranium, and they viewed that as a principled. They had a principled objection to Iran retaining that right. But if you think about where we are, where we just bombed Iran, we just saw a conflict play out over the last 12 days, and Iran may still retain highly enriched uranium somewhere in their country. Obviously, JCPOA was working for us and was something that we probably should have stayed in.
The other critiques of JCPOA were that it didn't deal with Iran's ballistic missile program and its nefarious actions with its proxies in the Middle East. What do you make of that criticism? And what do you make of how vocal Benjamin Netanyahu was? He came to Congress during the Obama administration and criticized president on American soil. And then, of course, Republicans in Congress, and eventually President Trump as a candidate was highly critical of the JCPOA.
Yeah, look, I think the Prime Minister Netanyahu was obviously very effective in making his case for why he thought the U.S. should pull out. I think that case was made vociferously at the end of the Obama administration when JCPOA was being considered by Congress. Obviously, that criticism fell on much more open minds when the Trump administration came into power in 2017, and so thus began the process of the degradation of relations between the U.S. and Iran, and also eventually the U.S. withdrawal. Look, it's true that JCPOA did not cover everything under the sun in the U.S.-Iran relationship. It did not cover Iran's support for militant groups or terrorist groups. It did not cover or minimize Iran's ballistic missile program, which we already mentioned is one of the largest in the region. And of course, it had nothing to do with human rights. However, that's true for most arms control and non-proliferation agreements. I mean, these agreements are designed to get at these types of weapons or capability to develop these weapons that are truly existential in nature for most countries. And so, yeah, it's a lot of these agreements are kind of technical and military in nature. They're designed to solve a discrete set of problems. And I don't mean to minimize the problems. There's obviously a lot of complexity to JCPOA because JCPOA was not just like the New START treaty between the United States and Russia, who already have nuclear weapons, which is focused on limiting the number of weapons they have. This was designed to create all of these different locked gates for Iran to have to walk through to be able to get to a nuclear weapon. And so the reality is, I think an ideal agreement between the United States and Iran that could lead to peace between the two countries and stability in the region would, of course, be great. But the reality is that wasn't what we could focus on in the final couple of years in the Obama administration. And frankly, if you're able to negotiate an agreement that covers the missile program, support for these terrorist and militant groups, and grants economic relief and doesn't cover human rights, but you leave the nuclear program alone, I think that we would criticize that agreement as well. And I won't speak for the negotiators in the Obama administration, but I fully believe that they were hoping if they can get JCPOA through and show that it's working, and then the Iranian potential weapons program is prevented, that they could move further down the road in trying to stabilize the region and come to some agreement on these other items as well. So it seemed to me to be part of a stepwise process that really never got a chance to move forward because obviously once the Trump administration came in, they withdrew from JCPOA, they began a maximum pressure campaign, the relationship became a little bit more poisoned, and of course, over the course of the last administration to today, a lot of other things happened in the region that prevented that type of JCPOA diplomacy from taking place again.
What do you think would have happened if Hillary Clinton would have been elected in 2016 and the JCPOA stayed in place?
It's a good question. I think there probably would have been a really, really heated debate. I suspect that Clinton administration would have stayed in JCPOA. However, they would have also put a lot of stress on the agreement because there were a lot of other things Iran was doing at the time that the United States and Israel probably would have responded to. And I also think, as demonstrated by Israel most recently, Israel was willing to go to great lengths to try to disrupt that agreement to the extent possible. I mean, we knew that the United States and Iran were about to send delegations to have potentially their final meeting to hammer out a nuclear deal about a week ago. And Israel began this massive air campaign, which not only prevented the meeting, but frankly may have disrupted diplomacy permanently or semi-permanently, as it doesn't seem like Iran's interested in talking anymore. And so there is some opportunity cost to getting out of JCPOA and getting set on the trajectory that ended up with where we were with Operation Midnight Hammer as of Saturday.
What was your work on this issue during the Biden administration? There was this kind of pause for pause deal that happened in 2023, which basically said, acknowledged that Iran had 60% enriched uranium and said that if, as long as they froze it in place, there would be limited sanctions relief. How involved were you in that, and how do you respond to the criticism that this was a giveaway to Iran that enriched the regime and allowed them to spread their nefarious actions?
Yeah, look, so I think that anytime there's going to be any sort of sanctions relief or lax enforcement of sanctions for Iran, it will always be criticized as a giveaway. And the question is you're negotiating some sort of bargain, what are you getting in return? The reality is we weren't in a place to negotiate a new deal with Iran in the sort of after 2022. You'll recall there was an attempt to renegotiate and return to JCPOA. The Iranians never came forward with answers to some of these questions regarding their prior activities. They didn't want to sign up to some of the more stringent IAEA measures that would come into force. And by the way, looming over all of this was a series of massive protests in Iran against the regime in the fall of 2022. And however, we did not want the situation to get worse. So all of our efforts for the last 2 years of the Biden administration in 2023, you referenced, and then last year as well, were designed to try to stabilize relations on this nuclear issue. We wanted to make sure that we demonstrated to Iran we were committed to a diplomatic process. We told them what we would be willing to take certain steps to inspire their confidence and their trust in a process and hopefully create an environment in which we could start direct negotiations again in the future. But our expectation for them is that they would have enhanced cooperation. They would start to let the IAEA back into these sites, and because they had slowly sort of ratcheted down the amount of transparency they were providing to IAEA inspectors. And most importantly, they wouldn't creep closer and closer to a breakout capability by having a lot of enriched uranium that they could rapidly turn into weapons grade uranium. And so we had this sort of discussion about trying to take some unilateral steps each to see if we could build confidence in a process. We tried that. You referenced 2023. That was an important milestone where we actually showed that maybe we could sort of come to terms with some of these unilateral measures to build confidence in a process. And then, of course, October 7th happens. That puts a big pause on our ability to meet regularly with the Iranians. And then, of course, their proxies fell. We saw kinetic action in April and October. And that really brings us to the Trump administration, where we are now. But our hope was to try to stabilize our relationship and, again, create this environment where we could actually talk to one another, given that the nuclear issue was not detached from everything else happening in the region, especially post-October 7th. And then eventually, if there were to be a second term or a Harris administration, we would be taking our best shot at directly negotiating a new nuclear deal.
Do you think I know the circumstances were different during the Biden presidency, but if Biden knew that he could bomb the 3 nuclear facilities in Iran and the response from Iran would be as limited as it has been in this case, that he would have or should have taken advantage of that opportunity?
It's a really good question. I've actually been thinking about this and what my advice would have been. And I think for me, and I can't speak for what President Biden would have done, I will say overall as an administration, we were committed to diplomacy and we're looking for a way to ensure that the military option was there and credible. That's why the United States and Israel participated in these Juniper Oak exercises to show that we sort of militarily could operationalize this type of operation that Donald Trump eventually chose to do. Because we thought that cudgel was really important, a really important piece of coercive diplomacy to try to get talks going. That being said, we hadn't really established a very clear threshold for when we felt we needed to act militarily. I think that as Iran sort of continued to creep and make creeping progress towards weapons-grade uranium and a substantial stockpile of 60%, that would become a growing concern to us. But one of the key pieces of intelligence information that has been offered publicly on a repeated basis, both in the Biden administration and in the current administration, is that we've observed no decision by the supreme leader to pursue a nuclear weapon. Now, I think a lot of people will argue that threshold may or may not be the most important threshold to think of, because honestly, if they were this close to a decision point and they could break out in a day, you might feel really nervous that, well, we might not pick up that they've made the decision and a bomb will just show up, or they test a device, or Lord knows they blow one up over the Red Sea to show that they have it, and then it's too late. But the other sort of aspect of this that's working in the other direction is if you go too early, if you do this before there's been a political decision that's been made, you might sort of speed run Iran to that decision. And so we were sort of in this place where you have to be really careful and look for these indicators that show that they're getting closer and closer. So I guess from my perspective on a technical basis, I really wanted to keep an eye on not just enrichment. We know Iran could enrich. They've been enriching for a really long time, for decades. And yes, stockpiles of 20% and 60% in large amounts means that they may have multiple bombs worth of HEU if they decided to enrich it to weapons grade. But the key things that we had not observed were, can they make a nuclear weapon that could go off? And have they made a decision to pursue a nuclear weapon? As the decision part is always going to be kind of a 0-1, a black-white indicator, right? But weaponization activities, if we saw a lot of that and we felt that the Iranians, whether the supreme leader knows it or not, seem to be like getting ready or getting as close to that threshold as possible. So like, they could go to the boss and say, hey, we could do this really fast if you just make the decision to do it. We were always watching that space because that to us was always going to be more concerning because, again, we knew they wanted to enrich. We thought we'd have good fidelity on when they made a decision. Another reason why the decision is really important is the supreme leader, since coming into power, has outlawed a nuclear weapon. And we'd seen no indication that he was questioning that. We're seeing more indications of that now after the military action, but at least at the time, we thought that his fatwa as the religious and governmental leader of the Iranian regime was going to be in place and was going to be the guidance to the rest of the government. So it would be surprising for us for some Iranians to clandestinely go all the way to developing a testable or deliverable nuclear device unless he said it was okay to do so. So it was less about it's not as if there was sort of a blank, slate here that people were working with. The supreme leader had actually already decided we're not allowed to have a nuclear weapon, as you outlined at the beginning of the pod. And what we're looking for is him essentially reversing that decision.
Netanyahu and members of the Trump administration have made this argument that there was some kind of a fundamental change that happened leading up to U.S. decision to bomb the 3 sites. In March, Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard said the political decision to go for a nuclear bomb had not been made. But then in June, the IAEA said that Iran had breached the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. What do you make of the argument that there was some kind of fundamental change?
Personally, I haven't seen it. And again, I think maybe in part it's because my bias is we were resting on analyzing the supreme leader and whether he was changing his mind. It's true that Iran was found in non-compliance during the last IAEA Board of Governors meeting where they sort of discussed topics like Iran. However, that is actually not a new development. That is something that has been true about Iran because they weren't complying with the IAEA directives for some time. The difference was the board decided to actually find them in non-compliance, which seems like a procedural step, but actually important because it allows for other actions to take place, such as a referral to the UN Security Council, potentially triggering the snapback of UN Security Council sanctions that have basically been held in abeyance by the Security Council resolution that implemented the JCPOA. And so this was a formal step in the direction that you need to go if you're ready to bring all of those resolution sanctions back into effect. However, one thing that has not changed is the Supreme Leader making a decision to pursue a bomb. And we've seen as far as I can tell, sitting here on the outside with you, no indications that Iran has creeped closer on its ability to weaponize and create a nuclear weapon that could actually be used. It seems like to me, after last October, Iran's air defenses, its ability to defend, has gone down to almost zero. The Israelis were able to operate with impunity. They were able to selectively target all of the major facilities, factories, industrial centers necessary for this whole fuel cycle that we talked about at the beginning of the pod that gets Iran to enriched uranium and then potentially, being able to weaponize it. And there was an opportunity there. So I think the Trump administration is in a little bit of a pickle because obviously they decided to go along with it because, hey, their bombers could fly in there. Airmen would not get shot at. The Iranians essentially were on their back because of the Israeli airstrikes before. And all the U.S. had to do to help was use the bunker busters, the massive ordnance penetrators that Israel did not have, to try to hit these facilities that are deep underground. And of course, we're all waiting now to see if they were successful or not. And in a lot of ways, I hope they were successful because they've already decided to take this action. What's on the other end of this decision, I think, is an Iranian covert effort to develop a nuclear weapon. they just faced what was a near existential war where Israel was discussing the options of taking out the regime. So if you're Iran, I'm not sure what else you have to lose at this point because you tried the slow way. You tried the sort of hedging way that gave you leverage and diplomacy to try to trade pieces and parts of your nuclear program, whether it's enrichment, enriched uranium stockpiles, centrifuges, the sort of currency that they had to work with in the negotiation. They tried to trade that away for economic relief over the course of negotiations that have been on and off, including in JCPOA. Now you find out that that approach essentially is irrelevant anymore. They're not going to be able to get anything out of that type of negotiation. And they were just faced with an existential threat. And so, particularly for hardliners who might be more in charge now than they were before, it really leaves bad options. Either you're capitulating and you're accepting a much stronger deal that puts your sort of uranium enrichment capability and every other aspect of your nuclear program really in a tight box, or you need to think about a covert nuclear weapon program, do something like what North Korea did, which is go deep underground, keep the facility and all of the people who know about it small and compartmented, and you only show up for air when you're ready to test a nuclear device.
You seem to be putting a lot of confidence in our ability to peer into the upper echelon of the leadership of Iran and understand their intentions. Are you confident? You know, you were inside the Biden administration. Are you confident in our ability to truly understand what the supreme leader wants to do and how the inner workings of the power structure of Iran take shape?
So I guess I'll say this. I think I felt like we had more insights and understanding during the last couple of administrations, in part because the Iranians didn't really hide what they were doing. They were open about having a civilian nuclear program. They weren't transparent about what they were doing during the Ahmad plan. They weren't always transparent with the IAEA in a public way, but they were very transparent about their political intentions, even in a public way, whether it's through IAEA statements, Supreme Leader statements that came pretty regularly. So we felt like between that and our intelligence capabilities, we had a pretty good understanding of what their intentions were regarding the nuclear program. That could be lost now, right? One of the consequences of this is the Iranians may decide they shouldn't be talking publicly at all. They've passed a law in the Majlis, their assembly, that was approved by the Guardian Council for President Pezeshkian to shut down all cooperation with the IAEA, which it sounds like he's implementing. The Supreme Leader was in a bunker for basically 12 days. He'd finally come out and issued a statement. But I think that what we're going to see here is a degradation in our ability to know really what the Iranians are up to, because they've realized that, as I mentioned before, their approach of doing public posturing and being transparent and trying to sort of monetize and use that transparency and their nuclear program for negotiations has resulted in what happened over the last 2 weeks. And so they might try a different tack. They'll be less confident that their public statements are being heard well, so they'll stop making them. They'll be less confident in their ability to protect the information they have, in their efforts to compartmentalize the program, and so they might have much stronger counterintelligence efforts. And of course, they're shutting off cooperation with the IAEA, which and the Director General is one of the people in the international system who was trying to explain to the world what Iran was up to and when. And so we've lost that source of information as well. So without getting into the nitty gritty of how we know what we know, I think that there's definitely going to be a change in the amount of information that the United States will receive. And more importantly, a change in the amount of information the world receives, because this is a global problem. And a lot of the successful U.S. efforts in pressuring Iran have been because we've been able to get our allies, partners, and frankly non-aligned countries to direct their attention and concern at the Iranian regime.
So, over the last week, there's been this great debate among observers of foreign policy about the effectiveness of the U.S. strikes. The Trump administration has been extremely combative over the issue and trying to say that they obliterated the Iranian nuclear program. Others are more skeptical. What's your assessment of the effectiveness of the strikes?
Yeah, so let me answer your question, and then but let me preface this with saying, in a lot of ways, to me, over the medium and long term, it doesn't actually matter, because I think the Iranians are going to be able to reconstitute the capability. It's just a matter of time. That being said, I understand why the Trump administration is upset. From a military perspective, as I think the chairman of the Joint Chiefs has laid out, they executed their plan as they were supposed to. The bombers were able to take off. They entered Iranian airspace. They were able to deliver bombs on targets, and it sounds like they did that successfully. They were able to leave Iranian airspace, return home. Pilots, airmen, and women are safe. And so that's sort of mission accomplished from the military operational perspective. I think what they have not been as transparent about is, what was the reasonable percentage that they were going to succeed? Was there an 80% chance that they were going to accomplish the sort of objectives of the strike as opposed to accomplishing the strike? Was it 50%? We don't really know what reliability they were placing on this operation. Just having bombs go into the mountains is something to talk about, and that's great. And I think Secretary of Defense Hegseth talked about how successful the mission was from that perspective. But we don't know if they were able to destroy the centrifuge cascades at Fordo in the deepest tunnels. We just don't know. We do know that these aren't magical weapons, and that Fordo is built into a mountain, so that leads to some doubt. And so this question of whether the facilities have been effectively destroyed is really, or functionally destroyed, I should say, is really important. And I say functionally because you don't need the bomb to actually go down all the way into an enrichment hall and blow up all the centrifuges. What you need to do is create some sort of earthquake or geological effects that break the centrifuges or disrupt their operation in a way that means the Iranians can't rely on them anymore. Centrifuges, particularly when they're spinning and under operation, are really sensitive to shaking and that type of the type of thing that would happen when you drop a 30,000-pound bomb into a mountain. And so there's potential that the weapon effects actually disrupted and destroyed effectively or functionally the enrichment cascades at Fordo and the other sort of operations underground at the other two sites. But we don't know. And I think obviously there's a public interest here. But more importantly, if you're looking to engage in diplomacy or further military action against Iran, you actually need to know what's left. You have to establish a baseline for what's still in operation. I think the key point to me, there are definitely sites, as we've seen in publicly reported, that the United States chose not to bomb. There's potentially a deep underground facility at Esfahan that CNN's reporting the United States decided not to bomb it because it's too deep underground, even for the weapons we have. And so that's a great area for Iran to try to stash either surviving equipment, the 60% uranium that everyone seems to be looking for, or anything else they need to reconstitute their program. I will say I think it's hard for them to do that quickly, though. And so if the point of the strikes were to delay the program and buy more time for diplomacy because the Trump administration thought that would be a prudent way to approach the kind of next phase of diplomacy, that's one thing. The problem is the Trump administration has talked about this as if it's kind of game over, that there's actually nothing to worry about. In fact, the president has even said that maybe we don't need a deal. That to me is really the wrong answer, right? Because I think no matter what happens, whether they were immensely successful and completely obliterated all three sites, or whether there's leftover centrifuges that Iran can salvage after months of digging out of facilities, Iran still has the technical know-how to have a civilian nuclear program. They know how to enrich, they know how to make centrifuges, they know how to enrich to a relatively high amount, and they've proven that. And if they're just trying to do it for a few bombs as opposed to being the basis of this broader strategy to have massive number of centrifuges and massive enrichment capacity because they wanted to be able to trade this away in negotiations over time, if they're just looking for a small, covert, clandestine program, they don't need to take years to rebuild all three sites. They just need to pick a location to do all the necessary activities to get to a bomb. That's a very good question.
What do you make of this whole trucks parked outside the facility that may have moved? I guess, is it hard to move what does it look like? Can you just bring out a sack of 60% uranium and throw it on the back of a truck and move it around? Is it volatile? What does it look like? How can you move it?
So I don't know how volatile it is. I think it would be sort of contained in a sort of a protective container for movement. That being said, yeah, you can transport this stuff around in trucks, and the Iranians do this a lot. They move material from site to site. For example, if they're doing conversion at Esfahan from the the uranium that we talked about that you mine out of the ground into the uranium that you need to feed into centrifuges to enrich, they're transporting that stuff to enrichment sites at Natanz and Fordo. So it would be easy for the Iranians to move stuff around. Now, the sort of the trucks in question that everyone's obsessed with, I mean, we don't really know, right? We don't really know what those trucks were up to. I think the administration has said, they were there to try to protect the entrances. Obviously, the people are alleging that these were the trucks that were used to move uranium out. But I think it's really important to note, as far as we know, there could have been uranium just stored at Esfahan because Esfahan was a conversion facility, and they need to have it as kind of a way station for the uranium that comes in from the mines, and that transitions into that's converted into the uranium that you need to send off for further enrichment. And so Iran's a big country, 90 plus million people, as Tucker Carlson reminded Ted Cruz recently, and it has a sprawling nuclear program across its country. And so the idea that there's no enriched uranium anywhere in the country, I think, is pretty absurd.
What do you think the political lesson that will be learned, not just in Iran, but maybe in other countries as well, is that it's not worth having a nuclear weapons program because the US is so strong that they'll just blow it up before it ever gets a chance, and their intelligence services are so good that they're going to figure it out? Or that the North Korea lesson, that this is the only way to protect yourself and you should pursue a nuclear weapon at all costs?
So, I mean, I think it's both. And you've hit on what I think is the most interesting question for people who are like me in the non-proliferation policy world and thinking, down the road, particularly in an environment where some of our allies and partners even are worried about the U.S. as an actor in the world. Are we reliable? Are we going to live up to our security commitments? We have these extended deterrence commitments with 34 or 35 treaty allies where we would use our nuclear weapons to defend them. If they don't think that we're going to do that anymore, then a country like South Korea may think it needs a bomb. I really worry that the lesson they're going to take away is a second one that you mentioned, that what they need to do is shut down all of their transparency, stop cooperation with the IAEA, and if they want to bomb, they're just going to go the clandestine route like North Korea. I do think some countries, depending on the countries and the neighborhood they're in, if they're not an ally of ours, if they're not a friend of the U.S., then they probably think they're running a pretty high risk. If the United States is willing to use its military strength to engage in what we would call counterproliferation efforts, essentially stopping the process from going from a civilian nuclear program to a bomb, then a lot of countries may question whether it's worth it. That being said, you run a real risk if that's your only non-proliferation strategy, is to bomb countries' civilian nuclear programs, because a lot of countries may then decide to go the covert route, or a lot of countries are willing to run the risk and test the United States. Are you really going to do that to every country? Because we should keep in mind that Iran not only sits in a unique neighborhood in the Middle East that is particularly unstable right now, it's also been an extremely hostile regime to U.S. interests and Israeli interests and interests of some of our Arab allies. And so countries that are more non-aligned, that aren't outright adversaries of the United States, but they may have adversaries that are not the United States, they might be more willing to run the risk now because they don't think the U.S. is going to bomb them. And they see that non-cooperation with the IAEA won't necessarily create the same kind of problems it created for Iran. And Iran might demonstrate over the coming months that actually there's a viable pathway here for you to have a nuclear program, not talk to the IAEA at all, if they're allowed to rebuild. And it seems like, to me, part of the Trump administration's advocacy for the strikes being so successful is to preserve this ceasefire and essentially wash their hands of the issue. And if that's true, then as a country, that there's only so much patience, at least in the current administration, that you need to worry about. If you can get on the other side of that patience, then maybe you're free to go for a weapon.
There's also this interesting situation strategically that you have if you're a power that's considering a nuclear weapon, between the period when you just make that decision to pursue weaponization and the point that you actually have it. There's this period of vulnerability that would have to weigh heavily on the decision making process, right?
That's right. I think a lot of countries, and maybe the strongest argument for these countries to not go nuclear is if you're bordering a large nuclear armed aggressor. So, like, let's say you're a country in Eastern Europe and you are dealing with the threat of a Russia that has shown it's willing to invade Europe and attack Europe, and frankly rattle the nuclear saber at Europe. You're running really high risks that Russia will try to take action to kill your program in its infancy if you decide to go that route. Obviously, your calculation there, the risks that you're thinking about is, can I keep this secret enough for long enough that Russia won't know about it until it's too late? Again, using the Russia example. Can I make sure, as part of that strategy, that the United States is tacitly okay with me having this program and is willing to protect me for as long as it takes for this program to get off the ground? And then, of course, third, when's your big reveal? Because the purpose of that type of program, presumably, is to increase your deterrent. For a deterrent to be viable, for you to be able to threaten Russia in this scenario with your nuclear weapon, you actually have to tell them about it and tell the world about it. When do you feel like you're going to be prepared to do that as a small country who's just had a sort of an infant nuclear program and maybe got to one weapon? Do you test it and you say you have more than you actually do? Because Russia's got a lot of nuclear weapons, right? And so the idea that you could test it and Russia would then say, oh my God, I'm deterred, I would be surprised. Russia seems like it's willing to accept a ton of risk right now in their foreign policy adventures around the world. And so, and Russia's just one example, but I think there's a lot of reasons why a country does not want to proliferate. And frankly, if you're one of the U.S. allies, you want this administration to double down on the security guarantees. And while January, Washington's impression of NATO, it looks a lot different than it does after this week, where the president seemed to be more all smiles and really committed to the alliance. And so there's an unpredictability here in Washington's willingness to live up to those agreements that's in question. But overall, countries run really huge risks if they try to do this right now. And in part, it's because if they're friends of ours, that means China and Russia are probably not their friends, or North Korea. And if they're non-aligned, the risk is that other countries around them may pursue this. And again, before they get to a weapon, those other countries may decide to act militarily really quickly. And can you protect your program? Because once the cat's out of the bag and you're attacked, I think you're in a war that probably is focused on regime change.
Well, even if Iran was able to, say, test a nuclear weapon 3 years down the road and it surprises and shocks everybody, you would think Israel would launch a massive attack on the country, and the notion that they would be able to protect their technology and go from just having the ability to do a test to delivering a weapon, it seems like, yeah, just because you're able to test something in the desert, and the reaction to that from Israel and the United States would likely be devastating.
Yeah, and so that's why it's a bad option too, right? And Iran is just left with bad options. I think there's two bad options of capitulation or try to covertly develop a bomb. Iran has demonstrated that they're really penetrated by Israel. I mean, the Israelis have been able to show over the past year and a half an amazing capability for knowing where Iranian leaders are almost at all times. And so the idea that Iran could perfectly hide this program, I find hard to believe. My only point is, they might not have better options. I think they're caught between these two options, and again, they could pursue a hybrid approach where they decide they're willing to accept some sort of negotiations or diplomacy for a period of time that allows them to find a way to develop a more covert option, and that could be a years-long process. But yeah, I think if you're Israel and frankly other countries in the region or us, you have all the incentive in the world to act at that point. And going back to where we were thinking about this in the Biden administration and prior administrations, I mean, if you detected a sincere Iranian effort to go for a bomb, there's probably an ultimatum for negotiations, and then after that it's military action. You're not sort of letting that process drag out very long. And again, we're in a world where Iran may decide to do that because they tried the other way, and it didn't work out for them either.
Running out of time here. I just wanted to pose one more question to you. Take us outside of Iran. There's been other countries that have recently started talking about developing nuclear weapons. Japan, South Korea, Poland even talked about it. How do you think this whole episode will affect proliferation around the world outside of Iran?
Look, I think every country's a little bit different, right? And so the countries that you listed are all close allies of the United States who are nervous. And a lot of the nervousness comes from some of the statements made by U.S. officials in January, which brought these allies into question. Can we rely on the U.S. to defend us if we go to war? Poland's in a tough neighborhood. Japan and South Korea in tough neighborhoods as well, whether that's because of, Japan and South Korea in tough neighborhoods as well in Northeast Asia because of both North Korea and China. Um, the key measure for the U.S. government in avoiding proliferation, and there are people who think that allies proliferating maybe is not a bad thing. Our entire nuclear strategy, the past 70 or 80 years of effort, have been focused on preventing that from happening. We have always wanted to maintain as few decision-making centers for nuclear weapons use as possible. In part, that's why the United States decided in the 60s that we needed to completely overhaul our strategy for how we defend our allies. We decided we needed to put a lot more conventional forces in Europe. We decided we needed to maybe forward deploy nuclear weapons, and frankly, we needed to grow our nuclear arsenal overall, not just keep pace with the Soviet Union, but demonstrate to allies that we never felt like we would need to really trade city for city. We weren't really focused on this question of Washington for Berlin. We wanted to show that our allies that actually we have the military capabilities to prevent that tough choice from ever happening, because we would be able to engage in this conflict in the region and frankly win against the Soviet Union if they decided to attack NATO. So we're back at this place where we need to reassure our allies that not only that our military capabilities are sufficient to defend them as adversaries are growing their own nuclear arsenals, but that our will to do so, and it starts at the top with the President of the United States, our will to do so is unchanged. President Biden really focused on rebuilding alliances over the course of his 4 years. Part of that was a lot of effort that we put into this extended nuclear deterrence conversation that we have with allies like Poland at NATO, but also in bilateral discussions with the ROK and with Japan. And my hope is, as the Trump administration staffs up, they're going to see the wisdom of restarting those dialogues and really leaning into how we and our allies would both approach those military scenarios together, because ultimately this all comes down to the national security of the ally. What threats are they most worried about, and is the United States going to help them deal with those threats? Because nuclear weapons, as much as we've talked about them over the past 30 years as kind of this weird thing, we're trying to manage the reduction in forces post-Cold War. We've negotiated these successive treaties with Russia to further reduce our forces decade after decade. I think, unfortunately, that time has ended, and now we're talking about nuclear weapons as much more central to geopolitics and defense strategy, not just for the United States, but for a lot of countries in the world. And so our national leaders need to take this issue seriously, because you need to both maintain a strong arsenal that's able to deter these types of attacks against the U.S. and our allies, and convince them that they don't need nuclear weapons. But you also have to do so in a way that's responsible and doesn't create the type of security circumstances that wherein countries like China and Russia are going to produce a bunch of weird, new, and exotic capabilities to try to get around the basic math of nuclear deterrence. And so we're back in this sort of Cold War mentality, unfortunately, about having to think about these issues. But it's so important for political leaders to refamiliarize themselves with nuclear weapons issues and non-proliferation, because we want to make sure there's no nuclear war, no nuclear use anywhere, and we want to make sure that there are no new nuclear weapon states. And those things are going to come into tension.
Yeah. Well, this has been a fascinating and educational conversation. I really appreciate your insight and taking some time to chat with us. Best of luck with your work. It's super important, and well, obviously this is going to be something that we continue to follow, not just throughout the rest of the Trump administration, but probably for the rest of our lives. So super important work that you're doing. Again, thank you. Pranay Vaddi, thanks so much for your time.
Thanks, Drew. It was a pleasure, and hopefully you have no reason to call me on again if there's a nuclear crisis, but if that unfortunate day does come, I'd be happy to come back and talk to you.
Awesome.